Okay, so for my blog too on non-Western cultures, I decided to do Japanese art. And the first picture I want to talk about is of four old women, and they're smoking. And I think the purpose of this was to create a work about Japanese life. And I think the motivation was to create a realistic sympathy for the women of Japan, because usually a lot of the art was male based. And one thing I find really interesting in this is if you look closely, um, everyone is looking down except for the mother, who is looking at the baby. And I feel like they're all in positions of submission. Another thing that I noticed that I thought was very prevalent was it's a diptych photo, because there's two frames. And I also felt like the faded colors were symbolic of the stresses in their lives. The next photo I want to talk about is this photo of two men fighting. And then one thing I kind of noticed is that it was sort of shocking that they were old, because you usually wouldn't see two old men fighting in Japanese culture, because I read and it said that the elderly are really respected in Japan. Another thing I kind of noticed was the guy standing up looks to me like he's some sort of samurai. And I know he doesn't have a sword or anything, but he has the robe and he has the sort of haircut that a samurai would have. And for the purpose, I was kind of, conflicted on this one, but I would say that the purpose was to entertain, because it's a very graphic, shocking photo. And I think that's what the motivation was too, was to shock the viewers due to the violence and the disjunction between two fighting old men. I thought it was very interesting. Okay, so the next photo I want to talk about is the photo of a cherry tree with a mountain behind it. And I thought of all the photos, this one was the most symbolic. So the first thing I want to talk about was the purpose. And I think the purpose was to create a work of beauty plus reverence. It's interesting how it's a nature scene, and I feel like this relates to a lot of Japanese art, because a lot of Japanese art is nature-based, like the famous wave. That's the one that a lot of people think of. And also, one thing I was reading was that the mountains and cherry blossoms are very prevalent in Japanese culture. Okay, another thing I want to talk about is Shinto. And Shinto was the religion in Japan that dominated before Buddhism. And it worshipped objects, like literal objects. So I think a lot of the motivation of this art was to create a piece of spiritual significance. I think this is a religious piece because the Shints focus so much on objects. And another thing I realized was I think this piece was highlighting the permanence of the mountain and the transience of the blossom, because every season this cherry tree is gonna develop new flowers and new stems and everything. I mean, this mountain is gonna stay there forever, and just the idea of that really stuck with me. Okay, so the next piece I want to talk about is this one, the Christmas tree and a church. And I think it's the artist trying to make contrast, because it combines city life right here of people going to church and then nature. I think he did a really good job with that. And I think his purpose was to create a work of aesthetic pleasure, both combining both city and nature. And his motivation was to contrast the two and show the two beauties of life. And I think the most prominent aspect of the work is the lake in the center, because I feel like it's combining the two aspects of life. And the action is people walking to church. Okay, here's the next thing I want to talk about is this photo right here. Hold on one sec. Sorry, I was just pulling up my notes. So the initial function of this photo was to create portraits of three beautiful young women. And I think the artist's motivation was to convey the woman's beauty, but also capture their styles, the hairdresses, the makeup, everything. And each woman shows a small symbol if you look really closely. Two of them are robes. One is a fan, and I think that represents the family crest. And also I think the painting is meticulous, and the detail is needed to convey the intricate designs on the expensive kimonos. The next photo, view of Amo no Hashirati. And I think I'll give you a better look of it. And I think the initial function was to create a painting of outdoor splendor. The artist's motivation was to convey the majestic beauty of the mountains, as we saw earlier in the painting in the Chicago Art Institute. This painting has a spiritual reverence for the Great Mountains, which dominates the painting by the number and size. The key symbols of work is the fortitude and permanence of the mountains. And sorry, I'll give you another good look at that. Sorry about that. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was my artist. And the artist I picked was Annika Takano. And like several of the artists whose work we have discussed, she describes females in her painting. Like the woman in the Three Beauties in the Present Days, Takano's women are beautiful. However, unlike the realistic approaches of the painters, the Three Beauties and the working woman diptych, Takano's characters are not realistic, but instead are highly stylized with exotic, exaggerated shapes. And also, in contrast to the other artists, Takano's colors, they're not really natural, but fantastic. And finally, while the other artists emphasize tradition, she seems to invoke the future. And I'll give you a look at some of her work. It really seems like modern contemporary art. All right, thanks so much.